WordPress sites are great at holding content. Got some words and pictures you want to show to the world? WordPress is a great tool for that job. I'd even argue that in at least some capacities, it's clearly the best for it. In some situations, you'll find yourself wanting to display different types of content. WordPress only provides you with two types of content you can create, which are posts and pages. It is possible to work with these two default content types, but it can be a hassle. For example, let's say you wanted to create a post for a recipe. For recipe posts, you may want to display a rating, ingredients, time required, etc. With just the default content types, you would have to constantly format each post and even keep track which posts are recipes. Even if you mangled a default post type to serve the purpose, the concept just doesn't fit well. Wouldn't it be great if we could separate regular posts and recipe posts? That's completely possible with custom post types. WordPress is all about creating content and making it easy to do so. With that said, there are various kinds of content, and WordPress can't account for all of it. We want the recipe plugin to have its own pages. We want to take advantage of the categories and tags and all the editors that come with posts, but on its own page. It would be quite cumbersome to have to set this all up, but WordPress provides an easy way to do this. In the resource section, I provide a link to the post types codex page. By default, WordPress provides 5 post types, which are post, page, attachment, revision, and menu. We are allowed to create our own or extend these. Let's create a custom post type. Inside the main plugin file, we're going to add an action hook called init. This hook is triggered when WordPress begins to initialize the data required for the current page. This hook should be used to help set up your plugin. The function we want to call is recipe init. This is where we should set up our custom post type. Let's create a file called init.php inside the includes folder and define the function here. Make sure to include it from your plugin file. In the resource section, you'll find a link to the register post type function. This function is extensively documented, so I suggest you take some time to read it after this lecture is over. Go down to the user contributed notes section. We're going to copy and paste this bit of code into the init function. Let's go over what this does. First up, we have this labels array. All these values are actually just pieces of text that will appear throughout the custom post type. Most of them are self-explanatory. You can refer to the documentation to learn more about where these labels will appear. You'll also notice that each label is translated. There's a new translation function called _x. This function is the same as the double underscore function, except the second parameter allows you to add a context. This is useful for when you have two words that are the same, but they have different meanings in the current translation. For example, the word bass is spelled the same, but there are two meanings. It can either mean the fish bass or the instrument bass. Therefore, the _x function can be useful to let the translator know about the various meanings and what the word currently being translated means. It doesn't really do anything for the plugin itself, it's just helpful for the translator. Let's change the text domain for each of these functions to our text domain, which is recipe. Next, I want you to change each text value to recipe instead of books like so. WordPress will take care of placing these labels in the appropriate spot. Even though it's not necessary, I'm going to leave the _x function alone. We are allowed to change these to the double underscore function, but that's not necessary. There's not much difference between these two besides the context parameter I mentioned earlier. Next up is the arguments array. This will contain a list of settings for the custom post type. The first one is the labels key. This will be set to the labels array we created previously. Next up is the description. This wasn't provided with the example, so I'm going to add it in right after the labels. This is just a simple description about the custom post type. I'm going to set this to a custom post type for recipes. The public value is whether or not the content generated from this post type is available globally throughout the site. Set this to true since we want it to be public. Publicly queryable asks if this post type can be used in URL to query it. This should also be true. Show UI asks if WordPress should generate a UI for you. Set this to true as we do want WordPress to generate the UI for us. We will later extend this UI to suit our needs. Show in menu asks us if this post type should appear in the menu of the admin dashboard. Set this to true. Query var works hand in hand with publicly queryable to help with adding the post type to query var array. This value should be true. Rewrite allows us to customize the URL for our custom post type. This accepts an array, but we only want to change the slug. Let's set this to recipe. You'll see what this looks like when we create a recipe. The capability type is a special setting. It allows you to define how this post type is handled by users. For example, who gets to publish recipes and who gets to review other recipes, etc. There are two ways we can go about setting this value. We can create an array with all the permissions, or we can just put in post. By setting it to post, you're telling WordPress to set up the permissions for you. WordPress will use the same permissions it uses for its other post types. This means that contributors can create recipes but can't publish. Editors can modify recipes and unpublish them as well. Basically, this takes care of permissions and such. Moving on, the has archive asks if our post type will have an archive. Let's leave this as true. Hierarchical asks if our plugin allows for recipes to have parent recipes and so on and so forth. In our case, it doesn't make much sense for a recipe to be built on top of another, so we're going to leave this as false. Menu position is the location of the menu item. I'm going to change this to 20. This value should be experimental for you. If you believe that your custom post type should be placed at the top, then you should set this to 1. The lower the number, the higher it's placed on top of the menu. Supports is a very important value to set. Let's take a look at the documentation for a second. This is an array of components we can add to our post type. What are they exactly? Well, if we take a look at a regular post, you can see we have this title field, a content editor, categories, tags, etc. We can actually use those in our post type without having to actually recreate them ourselves. Here's what we want to add support for. Title, editor, author, thumbnail. We don't want excerpts or comments. There is one more value we want to add, and that's taxonomies. Taxonomies may seem like a complex term, but it isn't. Taxonomies are basically just words or phrases related to our posts. For example, when you create tags, the WordPress search engine will search for those tags and find what posts have those tags. You can create your own taxonomies, but we want to take advantage of WordPress's built-in taxonomies. In our case, we want to take advantage of categories and tags. So this key's value should be an array with category and post tag. Before we declare this finished, there are two things we'll want to check. For this course, we'll be using the Gutenberg editor. For maximum compatibility, Gutenberg requires two settings for it to appear. In the supports array, we have to make sure the editor value is there. We already set that earlier, so that takes care of the first setting. The second setting is the show in rest key. I'm going to set this to true. WordPress has something called the REST API. We haven't talked about that yet, but all you need to know is that the Gutenberg editor requires the setting to be true. In a future lecture, I will go over the REST API in depth. Don't worry if you don't fully understand. Now, all we have to do is call the function register post type. The first parameter is the name of our post type, which is recipe. The second parameter is all the settings for the post type. Refresh the admin dashboard and you should now see the recipe post type being displayed. Just like that, WordPress will generate all these pages for us. You can even see our labels being outputted. You can create recipes and manage them easily using the WordPress UI. All it took was a few lines of code. We can now begin extending this post type.